Hi, good afternoon, good morning. Thank you all for joining us. I'm Sarah Jaziri. I am the director of the Frontline Freelance Register. This is our third webinar on covering COVID-19 safely. For you who don't know, FFR is a member association that represents freelancers who are exposed to risk in their work. And we do a lot of safety and campaigning for their safety and building resources for them so they can do the work safely as well. We're a project of the Frontline Club. This is our third webinar, and we're very fortunate to have a stellar panelist with us. We have Lauren Walsh and Spencer Platt, and we'll be talking about covering COVID-19 in New York City and how to do so safely. Just to quickly introduce who our panelists are, we have Lauren Walsh, who teaches at the New School and at NYU, where she's the director of the Getty Photojournalism Lab. Her most recent book, Conversations on Conflict Photography, features interviews with various photographers and photojournalists on conflict, and actually also features Spencer Platt. Spencer is an award-winning photojournalist who joined Getty Images in 2001, as well as covering the national beat. He also works in Africa, Middle East, Latin America, and Europe. And his publications, images are featured in various publications, including Time, Newsweek, the Paris Match, New York Times, LA Times, amongst many others. The format of this webinar is going to be a conversation between Lauren and Spencer. If you do have questions, please do feel free to type them in the chat facilities, and we will try and incorporate them as we're going along with the webinar. So that's my introductions. I'm going to now hand over to Lauren to start the conversation with Spencer.
Great.
So go ahead.
Thanks, Sarah. The audio is working. Can you hear me? Okay, so thank you, Sarah. Thanks to the Frontline Freelance Register and to everyone in the audience. And as Sarah said, we are going to run this as a Q&A. If you can type questions into the chat, we will try to incorporate them. By way of giving a little bit of setup to our discussion today, at the end of last year, my most recent book came out. It's called Conversations on Conflict Photography, and it's a book about contemporary photojournalism and about the industry. And it thinks, of course, about conflict photography and about conflict broadly. So it's certainly war zones that are covered, but also humanitarian crises and natural disasters. And directly related would be something like the visual coverage of an epidemic, like what we're going through right now. And the book is structured as a series of interviews with photographers who cover conflict around the globe, with photo editors and with NGOs, in order to understand the hows and whys of the photography that they put out. And I thought that the best way to do it would be to give voice to the people who are making and disseminating those images, to learn from their experiences, hear their insights, whether it's on the ground or in the newsroom, and then more broadly so that the news consuming public has a better understanding of how this industry works and also can be thinking about best practices and ethical concerns. And so that's what we're going to do here today, specifically regarding Spencer's coverage of COVID-19 in New York City. So by way of starting us off, I'm going to put up a slideshow of some of Spencer's recent work. Let me share this. Okay, so the slideshow should be up. And what we hope to discuss in terms of Spencer's coverage is physical risks, emotional tolls, questions of access, and ethical concerns. So New York City is a city of approximately 8.4 million people. We have 5 boroughs, and our current COVID-19 numbers stand at 139,000 confirmed cases, over 18,000 recovered cases, and over 10,000 deaths. So Spencer, by way of asking a very practical question to get us going, we've all been told to stay at home, to social distance. So many people are not using public transportation anymore. They're not using the subways, they're not using the buses. How are you moving around the boroughs, and how is this affecting your imagery?
Oh, all right. Great question. Thank you, Lauren, and thank you, Sarah, and thank you for folks that have come out to listen to this. This is a really great opportunity, and I know we're all going through a lot, and it's a very emotional story on so many levels for all of us. So thank you. But for me personally, as a New York City-based news photographer for Getty Images, I do consider myself primarily a street photographer in the classical sense of the people, my heroes like Ernst Haas and Warner Bischoff and people like that were kind of people that really were lifelong roamers, for lack of a better word, people who drifted through cities and towns and were constantly looking and seeing. And those people, Dorothea Lange would be another name that comes up, are my real inspiration in this. I always get around wherever I am on a motorcycle. I've been a motorcyclist for quite some time. It's not always the safest way, but it's my preferred mode of travel. It's very immediate. It's easy to get around. It's easy to navigate a city like New York with traffic and parking. And I like personally being exposed. I don't like being behind glass and windows. I've never really had an office. So it's the perfect mode of transportation, and especially during COVID, it's very easy. I can get places very quickly. Obviously, there's a lack of traffic now, but I can still get to all parts of the city extremely quickly and go on with my with my coverage. So that's how I navigate the terrain here in New York.
Great. So, and as these images are scrolling, if you want me to pause on any of them, we
Sure.
can also go back towards them. When you're out there and working, are you seeing other journalists, right? So the outbreak actually kind of started in New Rochelle, which is a town outside of New York City. And as I understand, a bunch of journalists were there and covering. If you were in New Rochelle, can you tell us about that? And how just a few weeks later is the experience looking and feeling different in New York City?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because back then it was the beginning of this, and we had no idea what was really coming, and we were still all gathering in tight groups, and no one was wearing a face mask. Maybe a couple, but not really. And we were going to press conferences basically every day, and a lot of members. I don't know. I can't give you numbers, but a fair amount of members of the media did come down with coronavirus because of that in those days. And I have noticed, I'm not a guy that's, goes to a lot of press conferences. I'm more of an independent kind of photographer. But I have noticed in the last, let's say, 2 weeks, I have seen a lot less colleagues. Some of my colleagues are doing phenomenal, mind-blowing work. So if I'm not seeing them, doesn't mean they're not out there. But there are a lot less members of the media that I see. I'll go through 2, 3, 4 days working the streets and working on some hospitals and other places where I always saw other photographers. And it's few and far between that I see someone now. I can't give you a reason why. I think there's a lot of concerns, medical concerns, insurance with some companies not wanting to put a freelance photographer out on the street. God forbid he or she comes down with COVID-19. So there's a variety of reasons, but no, I'm not seeing as many, let's say in the last 2 weeks, as I saw in the beginning days in New Rochelle.
I mean, even just to touch on some of those concerns you were just referencing about exposure, I'm seeing some of the questions, at least one of the questions is already asking about risks. So what kind of protective measures are you taking in terms of what kind of PPE are you using? Are you cleaning down your camera equipment? Are you taking extra steps to protect your family when you get back home? Anything in that nature?
Right. Those are the great questions. I have a face mask. Getty provided me a very thorough, efficient mask. I'll be honest with you. I usually am using this unless I'm going to someplace that I feel potentially more exposed. As a street photographer, 90% of what I'm doing is outside, and I don't like to use big lenses. I primarily use a small 35 millimeter lens, which requires me to get within the 6 feet range of people. That's just how I generally prefer to work. Again, I am outside, so everything I've heard that's pretty science-based is it's less an issue if you're in a outside space as opposed to indoors in a confined space with someone. I do, I have colleagues that literally leave their clothes out in a bucket in the hallway when they come home. I am not one of those people. I take my shoes off, of course, and I do wipe down my gear usually nightly with an alcohol swab. I mean, I can only speak from my experience. I've been a photojournalist for about 20, 25 years. And I think when you get into this profession, you're going to have to accept a certain amount of risk is going to come your way. If you're going to be a news photographer covering hard news, breaking news, you're going to have that conversation with yourself and your family that things are going to come up, whether it's a hurricane, tsunami, a war, what we're going through now. And there's just no way while the majority of the population is going to be behind, doors and inside, you are going to have to expose, well, if you want to continue working and if you want to, bear witness to the story, you are going to have to go out every day and cover it. And it just, there's nothing you can do to 100% protect yourself. So you're going to have to expose yourself into, and you do your best, you take precautions, because certainly you don't want to do something and then inadvertently spread this to other people, your family, friends, whoever. So that's the main priority and my main concern. But I do accept that risk. And again, that's with everything. That's not just with today's story. That's with the stories I've been covering over the years. So I'm constantly reminding myself of that when I go out in the morning and kind of question, why am I going out?
And so just to, the slideshow finished, we can go back into the images, but I think the audience couldn't see you while the slideshow was up, and you said, here's my mask, but you said, here's what I more usually use.
Yeah. So this is my mask, which I do use, especially if I'm outside a hospital or if I'm in some place which is, I feel more vulnerable. But when I'm really out, I'm wrapping a bandana around my mouth and nose. And again, as a street photographer, I'm not usually indoors. I'm not really getting terribly close to someone. I'm trying my best to keep a distance. But at the same time, I don't want to see images, whether they be my images or a colleague's images, that are everything shot with a 400 or a 300 millimeter lens. And it has that look of I'm far away. That gets banal very quickly. I think we, as the visual takers, picture takers, photographers, journalists, we do have to get close sometimes. We have to get into our subjects' personal space. And that's hard, because this is a story which is all about personal space and not breaching that personal space.
So Spencer, let me ask you, and I saw this as a question in the chat, and it's something that I was thinking about. So in the interview I did with you that's in my book, we focused on your coverage of conflicts and crises around the world. So Central African Republic, Gaza, Iraq, Ukraine. How is covering this similar to covering another conflict or crisis? And in what ways is it different? And particularly the question that came in was focused on, how is it different to cover a crisis that's happening right in your own backyard?
Oh, it's great question. Well, I'll take the second part of your question first, because for me, it's very similar to how I felt on September 11th. I was here. I covered one of the planes coming into the towers, and for me, that was a reminder. I mean, I was in my mid-20s, I guess, back then. And that was a reminder. I'd been brought up on this very traditional idea of what it meant to be a conflict photographer. And it always meant getting on a plane and going to an exotic location somewhere on the other end of the world. And 9/11 really brought home the reality that no, in this kind of new world we're living in, that's not necessarily true. And that, obviously happened in New York, and it spread around the world rather quickly. But that was an eye-opener for me. And I learned that lesson that war, conflict, unrest, it can happen wherever you are, wherever you're based. And you always have to be prepared for that, in a sense. And maybe not physically, you're not going to have a bag packed or whatever. So there's so much we can all do. But I do think mentally, you have to be a resilient person. You have to be someone, especially in journalism today, more than ever, you have to always be prepared for the unexpected. And that's, I think there's a recent book by Talib. He's a kind of economist, philosopher, and he had a book that came out a couple of years ago that I've been kind of re-listening to on my runs, and it's called Anti-Fragile. And, you know, it's his whole concept is like, you need to prepare your life not to be fragile. And it starts at the most basic level, being in shape, to getting into your finances, to getting into your career choices, and getting into how you see and experience the world, because the fragile will be the first victims when unrest happens. And he's not talking about unrest in the third world, or, you know, and he's talking about, you know, whether it be in London or New York or Madrid. And reading, when I'm listening to this book, I'm always reminding myself about 9/11, and don't be naive. Something can happen again in your own personal space. But what was the first part of the question? Sorry, that you asked before that.
How it's like covering
Oh, right.
foreign conflicts, and how it maybe feels different to be right at home.
Well, obviously there's not bullets flying, and there's not an enemy, and there's not a, you know, a border you can't cross, and all the rest of that happens when you're in a more conventional conflict. I would say in one way I found out is kind of the loneliness, the exposure. You're out, you're roaming. When I'm in Manhattan every day, or wherever I am in Brooklyn, especially when I'm in Manhattan, you just feel so exposed, because there's literally no one. I think yesterday or the day before, I was walking down Fifth Avenue, and Fifth Avenue, to those of you who don't know Fifth Avenue, it's like one of the most busy streets in Manhattan. Even at 3 in the morning on Christmas Eve, it's busy. And I was walking down at midday, and there was just like one or two. I was waiting. I had a picture set up, and I was waiting 5, 7, 10 minutes for anyone to walk by. And I kind of realized you are exposed, you stand out. So people will question you more. You know, in New York City, as a street photographer, you're really used to just disappearing in crowds and having the freedom to photograph at will, and no one really pays attention. Everyone's running somewhere, and maybe someone gives you a second glance or something. But now you take a picture, and it's like, hey man, who are you? What's up? What are you doing? And I experience that every day in New York. So that kind of reminds me, whether say I'm in Gaza or something, me as an American photographer in a place like Gaza, I stand out. People are, what are you doing? Who are you with? And when I'm in New York now, when it's just empty and I'm sitting with all my cameras, every day I'm getting these questions, and they're not all hostile. They're just a lot of curious people. And I get in some great conversations I never would have gotten into. You know, just 2 days ago, I was guys feeding the pigeons, and we got in this long conversation about, you know, and so it's really nice. But that would be for me what reminds me of being in wars, is just how exposed you are as a journalist.
So I have a bunch of follow-up questions. I'm going to try to go in order. The first one, what's the title of the book you referenced? Someone in the chat is asking.
It's called Anti-Fragile. And it's,
okay.
I may be getting Talib, I think, Talib. You should be able to find it. Yeah, it's a bit long-winded, but it's quite good.
Okay, so maybe the word I want to use is not fragile, but you also use the word resilience. And we'll go back into that edit of photos in a little bit, but some of the photos they're pretty tough. There's coffins, there's patients on stretchers. I've also seen images of refrigerator trucks outside of hospitals trying to handle the surplus of bodies, right? So there's these kind of psychologically distressing images and moments that you're actually witnessing, right? You're not just looking at the photo, combined with the anxiety of, am I being exposed? Are you feeling a kind of psychological toll or any emotional stress? Are there ever moments where you're like, this is really hard?
No, I mean, I have to be blunt. I mean, no, it affects me emotionally in terms of especially when I'm covering a hospital and I'll see a patient coming in, someone maybe who's young or someone who looks, you know, particularly vulnerable. It's impossible. You feel for that people. You all the time. You put your camera down. You shake your head, and it's just a reminder that this isn't just about stories and deadlines and getting a great photo. It is a really, really human, tragic story. I mean, I think the last count we have is 13,000 dead in New York City, which we have somewhere around 30,000 dead in the country. So you have like a third just here in New York City. So, you know, and I'm a big listener to our public radio station. They just had a story this morning about a young woman who worked on the subway and how she passed away. And it's impossible not to become emotional when you hear those stories. But getting back to what I was saying earlier, I do think when you do choose this kind of line of work, that you just are, again, you're gonna have to encounter these situations, and it can be, you know, photographing the dead here, or it can be, again, somewhere in another war. And you have to turn off a side of your brain that's temporarily that would question, why am I here? What am I doing? How, you know, that would be flooded with emotions, and concentrate on your job at hand. And your job at hand is bearing witness. There was a fantastic piece in the New York Times about a week ago by the writer, the travel writer, great travel writer, Paul Through, and you can find it if you Google it. I think it was called The Importance of Bearing Witness. And it was phenomenal. It talks about his time in Uganda as a young British student, and in the late 60s, and how the government was overthrown, and how he realized, instead of fleeing like many of his other British expats did, he stayed, and he realized it is imperative for me to bear witness to this, to watch this, to see this, to be the eyes on this. So I read that, and it was really inspiring piece. And it just reminded me, yeah, this is my job. This is, I don't have the option. I mean, many people that my wife and I know have packed up their bags and they've fled. They're in upstate New York, downstate. They're at long lost relatives' cabins. They've parts of New York are just pretty much empty. And we don't have a second home, but that's something that I never even thought of for a minute. This is my city. This is my time, in good and bad. I'll be here for it. And I'll be here, and I'll be bearing witness to what happens. So, yeah.
So in terms of that imperative to bear witness,
Mm-hmm.
coupled with what you said before, there's more often the reaction now of, "Hey man, who are you?" Are
Right.
you, talk to me about access. Like, where is it hard to get access? Are you, obviously hospitals, and I don't want you to talk about that. But what about police? Are police supportive? Are they seeing you as an essential worker? Are you receiving any kind of anti-press sentiment?
Yeah, but I always feel that, not always, but you do feel an amount of that, just being in a big city like New York. But I'll be honest, yeah, the last couple of weeks, I've had a lot more hostility, you know, just with police, with the general public. I'll give you a quick example. I mean, in terms of getting into hospitals and stuff, that's not really my beat. Getty, we have some incredible photographers that have really been doing wonderful work with that. I'm more concentrated, again, just on what I'm seeing on the street. I have some other stories I'm pursuing, but that's not really my thing. But you know, I'll give you a quick example. I've been trying to get into a couple of casket companies that are making caskets. They were overwhelmed, and I've approached some of them, and you just get shut out usually pretty quick. Which, okay, understandable, fair enough. But yesterday I was driving home my motorcycle through the rain, and I saw one of them here in Brooklyn, and they were moving caskets into a van, and I'm stopped at the light, and I said, I got to pull over and photograph this. It's an important photo, and it's my job. And I pulled over, and I walked up to them, and I explained who I am, where I'm from, and I mentioned this is public property. I was on a sidewalk, a road, and I'm just gonna take a few photos, and I'm gonna leave you alone. And they did not like that. They threatened to break my camera. They threw a box at me. I got the photos. I filed the photos. But that's something I encounter every day now, is people not necessarily always threatening. But then later yesterday, I tried to photograph a testing site here in Brooklyn, and immediately I was on public property. I'm always very careful about being on public property where anyone, whether you're press or whoever, can legally document what is happening around you. And I immediately had an individual come and say, you cannot photograph this. And you just get worn down by it. You don't want to, you can protest and fight and say, call, you know, the police, and I have a legal right. Some days you're just so tired, you're just like, walk away. But then I went around the corner, and there's a building site, and there was two individuals that own the building site, and they said, come up to our roof. It's an amazing view. So I went up, and I got a So and they were wonderful people. They were not police. They were just builders. And so you have those encounters too, where people, they want you. I think there's a lot of people I encounter, they realize you're pressed, you're serious, you're doing your job. They want you to tell the story and they want to help you. So it's a bit of give and take. Every day is a little different. So yeah.
So the people that are blocking you out, why do you think they're doing it? Is it that they are trying to protect victims from showing up in images? Are they trying to censor what gets out? I mean,
well, yeah, it's funny because there's a couple hospitals I photograph every day out in front of, and it's not something, honestly, it's not something I really want to be doing, but it's part of the job, and I have to do it, and I understand the importance of it. I'm doing this for history. I'm not doing this just for tomorrow's newspaper, also for newspaper and whatever. We won't have newspapers 100 years, but whatever we're using in 100 years to look back at this. So but first of all, I do try to be respectful. We don't really run full on faces and stuff. I always try to disguise it. Usually someone's in a mask, you can't really tell their face, so you do your best. But a lot of the medics, they're very supportive. They encounter me on the street and say, hey, what could I do? Thank you for taking my picture. Well, I've had a lot of that. But then I'll ask them politely and I'll say, hey, I'd love to do a series on you guys. And then they're like, oh, you got to go through the, human resource or whoever, you got to go through our media department. And then that's a whole more difficult thing, time consuming. I felt a change in the years after 9/11 in terms of security. People not wanting you to photograph buildings, people more suspicious of you. And that's just become a reality of the city. And I think cities around the world, it's people are more suspicious of cameras and what's your purpose. And now we have a world where the kind of media world's been turned upside down. And what media, are you partisan media? Are you left? Are you right? All that sort of stuff you get into. So that's just makes it even more difficult. So, it's kind of why I use these kind of small cameras. I don't go around usually with big, heavy cameras. I try to kind of blend in as best I can, just a couple of discrete cameras in a backpack. And someone asks me, are you pressed? Sure, I'm pressed. I'll show my pass, but I don't go around announcing myself as, here I am, the media. I try to kind of blend in, lay low a little bit. That's just the way I work. But yeah, it's definitely becoming a more difficult environment as a photojournalist.
I mean, it's maybe a little bit ironic because on the one hand, it's becoming a more difficult environment, as you said. And on the other, I think it seems that New Yorkers and probably Americans broadly are by and large, much more attuned to this crisis because it's in their midst, in their cities, in their towns, than they are generally to a foreign crisis.
Right.
I don't know. What do you make of that? Like, do you get the sense that the American public is far more invested in the specifics of this than they are of foreign stories?
Yes. You hope so. But again, it is hard to know because I have not been able to really have conversations with anyone. Usually I'd be going to a bar or a restaurant a couple times a week, and you kind of get the tone of your city, the feel, the vibe, what people are discussing, and all that's been cut off. So except for family and texting and email and some phone calls, I haven't really been able to get a feel for our people. Are they zoning out on movies? Are they turning into PBS NewsHour and the other shows at night and watching? I don't know. And then you have this other kind of fringe movement that's been starting with people protesting to open up certain towns and cities. And and then another thing that's going on is just a lot of misinformation out there. In the early days, I would be getting texts and emails from other photojournalists, from other photographers, things that were just blatantly wrong. They were spam, whatever, and saying the world's basically going to come to an end tomorrow. And these and it caused a couple of fights. I'm a big believer in mainstream media. I consume the main, for whatever that is, different for everyone. But I generally try to get my facts from a neutral news source, and I have very little tolerance for folks that don't get their facts from neutral news sources and then want to go online. And I know in the UK there's been a big thing with 5G, and I had some people here in the US that were friends of mine, and I thought, you know, and they were going on about 5G, and I just kind of have to shut them out very quickly, because I just have no tolerance for that. So going back to your question, are Americans, I think there's a lot of people very scared. I sense that. I can sense that in my own neighborhood. And again, I don't personally feel that, but I think there's a lot of people that I see taking precautions that to me look extreme. And again, kind of going back to the number of people that have just taken off. Maybe I'm being cavalier and getting back to Europe, you know, having spent 20 years going to some conflict zones and places. And I guess I can be accused of being a little cavalier at times, but to these matters, but you know, I do practice safe distance and I take precautions with my mask and everything. Yeah, so it's hard to read exactly where Americans are on this. I try the best I can, and I can only kind of cross my fingers and hope that they are paying attention and taking this very, very seriously.
I'm gonna actually pull up the slideshow again and have us talk through, because I have questions that are specific to some of the images. So let's see. So I think actually this might be an image that gets toward an answer to something I was thinking about, which is, in addition to documenting things like the emptying out of the streets and the victims in stretchers and frontline workers, how are you focused on some of the other stories like specific populations, undocumented individuals, the poor who face greater systemic challenges from the healthcare system? Or how do you visualize a story that focuses on the racism and xenophobia that has emerged more blatantly in the wake of this?
Right. Well, it's there's so much out there to cover. I mean, especially in a city like New York, and I'm sure other Paris, London, wherever you may find yourself. And sometimes you just don't even know where to start. And I've personally done some stuff on the homeless, the poor. I try to always keep, but again, you have to I mean, I am a general news wire photographer, so I'm not a documentary photographer, so I don't start my day saying, usually, I'm just going to do something on homeless. I have ideas in my head. I consume the news. I know what the kind of the headlines, what we're looking at, the direction of the story. So I keep in my head things to look out for. And for instance, this was a photo. You know, when I'm here, in normal times, I cover Wall Street a lot in the financial area, and so I tried a couple times a week, just go back down there, and it's very strange, very surreal, totally empty. But then I saw this man with his bucket out, for panhandlers, and panhandling and trying to get some money. And there's very few people down there, so his bucket was empty. And I watched it for about 20 minutes. I didn't see anyone even give it a second glance. So. You know, but I'm also trying to bring, you know, going back to one of my heroes in photography, Ernst Haas, who I don't know if people aren't familiar with his work, especially his color work. It's just phenomenal. I am always inspired by his use of color and drama, and whatever you're doing, whether it be in a war zone or covering coronavirus, I do think, you know, you have to try to bring some beauty to it. You have to give people a reason to pause and give something a second glance, and even when it's in difficult times. So that's what I'm always looking for in this. I'm looking at the colors, the shapes. But going back to what you're also asking, yes, I mean, there are so many stories, especially undocumented workers. Just 2 blocks away from me, there are young men who stand on the corner every day waiting for work. And they do this in normal times, in good times and bad times. But I've noticed going by them, their numbers are increasing, because I'm sure their jobs as cooks and delivery people or whatever else they were doing, laborers, they may have lost them. So it's stories like that that I try to pay attention to, and I put in the back of my mind, in the future, I need to, investigate this when I have time. And I would just say to people out there, who are listening, I mean, first and foremost, you have to get out there. And I think, just have the agency to get outside and wear the protective gear you feel is necessary, and walk the streets, take the subway. If the subway's running, your neighbor, just get out in the world, and I approach people that you want to do stories on, because a lot of people are really, as I said earlier, are really approachable in this, and they want to tell their story, and they want you to tell a story. I've noticed a bit of a hunger for that. I've approached some people on things that are kind of delicate, and I expect them often to slam the door in my face. And just today I had someone agree to something which kind of shocked me. And so yeah, that would be my advice. Is there is a it's a little off subject, but I'm going to say it quickly. The great British photojournalist, the greatest, I'm forgetting his name at the moment, the war photographer.
Don McCullen?
Yes, the great Don McCullen, the greatest of all. McCullen, when in a book or an interview I once read, someone asked him, what is his favorite photo? What is the photo that meant? And he said, I got to be honest. He goes, it was sometimes in the 70s, I guess, and he was walking around, he's living in London, and it was kind of a rough part of London. And he took this portrait of this man, this homeless man, that was just, you can find it in all his books, and it's just incredibly disheveled, but this man has such spirit and beauty and resilience in his eyes. And he goes, that's my favorite photo. And he said, what I love about it most of all, it's just around the corner from my house. I didn't need to get on a plane. I didn't need to leave Heathrow. It said there's always a story. So that's one of those things I keep in my mind too, is that little experience from reading that is you have to get outside your front door. You have to just go into the world with your camera, and things will line up. Things will happen.
So Spencer, let me ask you, one of the questions that came in said, are patients open to this photography as they're scared and afraid? Are they respectful of what you're doing? And then we could even go to, let's see, this image, right? So
right.
When I watched the Frontline Freelance Register webinar with Fabio Buccarelli, and a number of the questions were about consent. And of course, he was in homes and directly right next to families. You're standing on a street here, you're in a public place, you don't legally need to obtain any kind of consent, but are you thinking about dignity in portrayals?
Oh yeah. I mean, you can't really recognize this woman's face, at least I can. I'm trying to be as careful as I can. I'm working quickly.
I'm just going to show a few of these images.
And that first photo that you were showing, I did get yelled at. Some people came on the street. I'd just been driving through a neighborhood in Brooklyn on my motorcycle, and when I see an ambulance, I'll just pull over. Again, it's not something I want to do. I have to remind myself that what I'm doing is valuable, and it's in its own right, and it's for the history of this story. One of the, if not the most important stories of our lives. One of them, certainly. So, it's a tough question. You have to it's not for everyone. I'm sure a lot of people would not want to be doing this, would not want to be photographing this. All I can say is I try to do with dignity and respect. I try to be quick. I do not get in anyone's way. And I try to get out of there as quickly as I arrived. But it's just not always easy. There's no real short answer to that. It's, and again, I've had medics who've come up to me and emailed me and talked to me, and I'd one, he wanted me to autograph a picture for him for his, he was a medic in Mount Sinai in Manhattan. I talked with him briefly, and he said he wanted to show to his grandkids. And that meant a lot to me, because he was a medic and working in an ambulance. He was pushing a stretcher, and very nice guy. He found out my name. The pictures ran, I think, in the Wall Street Journal or something. He reached out and contacted me, and we had, and so for a lot of these people working in this field with incredibly dangerous, incredibly heroic work, I can't even, imagine how these people are doing that. The medics, the doctors. Yeah, a lot of them really do. They may not be able to tell you, but they do really appreciate what you are doing to show the world what they are doing.
I mean, and one of the things that I've been noticing, and some of this may just be a question of access, but specifically with that idea of they really appreciate showing the world what they're doing, we haven't actually seen a whole lot of imagery from inside hospitals. And despite a much higher death toll
Right.
here and now, the coverage by and large is a lot less of the graphic and explicit imagery than we saw with the Ebola outbreak of 2014, 2015. I mean, do you think that's just an access issue or something else going on?
New York is again, there have been photographers that have done some extremely important and wonderfully strong work in hospitals. Some in New York, but mainly outside New York, on the fringes of New York. New York is a very tough place in terms of access, even in good times. For a variety of reasons. It's one of the global biggest cities in the world. And there's just a lot of nervousness when it comes to people with cameras or microphones or pens interviewing, discuss. So it's tough. And that's, as a street photographer, I'm kind of relieved that I'm not having to push that so much. For me also, it's like, I think about, I don't have my own PPE. There's a shortage, there was a shortage in the city. I really don't want to take it away from a frontline worker, but that, I don't know. That's another subject. You do wish you could see more of that kind of access, but I do understand that it's hard to get it. And I think everyone, this is such a strange story. It seems like the facts almost shift daily, who has it, who doesn't have it, is there testing, isn't there testing, does this antibody test work, doesn't, I hesitate to Google if I have a pain in my toe because it'll be, you have coronavirus. It seems like we're scientists, medical community, journalists, we're all just kind of playing catch up with this. And people, some people are saying the country's going to open up by midsummer. Others are saying you're going to be shuttered until like 2023. So it's very tough. And so I think that leads into a lot of people's anxiety about not knowing really the true nature of this. It leads to a lot of anxiety and people shutting doors rather quickly.
I really hope we're not shuttered until 2023, like you just said.
No, I won't. I'll tell you that. No.
Spencer, I'm going to walk back through the slideshow, and then I want you to just stop me now and then and just give us some of the backstories or what you were thinking when you took pictures. Actually, this was the promo image. Why don't you talk to us about this one and what are we looking at?
This is a coronavirus testing site that was just opening. It was the first day, and of course there's a bunch of media showed up. They gave us like no real access, and it was kind of a bust visually. And then there was a bus stop right across from it, and I just it was kind of, when I'm photographing this, I'm often looking for images that are unsettled. And when I say unsettled, maybe they're shot at a slight angle, they're shot through glass, they're a little blurry. I mean, that's what I'm striving for. I'm trying to give my pictures an urgency, not your kind of classic just photograph, something that exudes some kind of motion, some kind of uncertainty with life. And I don't know, it gets a little heady. I don't always know what I'm doing with it, but that's what I feel. And so I saw this woman, she was reflected. You can see in the reflection, you can see the testing site, and she was waiting for a bus. I think she was a medical worker. And usually sometimes you put your camera up and people run, and she, I thought she was gonna do that. I thought I had 2 seconds, but she actually just kind of looked at me and let me photograph for, 4 or 5 seconds, 5 seconds. So, but I really had very little interaction with her.
I'm just gonna keep scrolling, let you pause me on whichever ones you.
Yeah, this is a classic, New York City, what we call spot news, breaking news, car crashes, gunfights, you know, this kind of stuff that happened every day, muggings, whatever. So this was police, but for me, it had twofold. I mean, first of all, we've seen an upswing in accidents and especially tickets. Not so much accidents in New York, but ticket numbers have doubled because people are speeding like never before because we have this lack of traffic. I see it every day when I'm out there on the highways, people just going by me like Lamborghinis at 120. The cops are few and far between. So this was a cop that was involved in a wreck along Fifth Avenue of all places, which is usually a really quiet traffic jam street. And you would be hard pressed to go over 30 miles an hour, 20 miles an hour on Fifth Avenue this time of day. But there was no one on it and people were speeding. I don't know exactly whose fault it was, the cop or the van, but so, and then the cops in the mask. So that was why I, and again, this is something I just stumbled on. JFK, always a surreal place to go visit these days. Security wise, they usher you out pretty quickly if they think you're media, but again, I am media, but there's no sign saying do not photograph. If they see you as media, they will usher you out. They will ask you to leave. So I just try to work discreetly and you know, you're not breaking any rules, but it is a strange place to be. There's an ultra Orthodox neighborhood down the street from me called Borough Park. Has one of the biggest Orthodox communities, I think, in America. And this community has been hit really pretty hard by the virus.
I'm going to keep scrolling because you have more images, but keep
Sure.
from Borough Park. Keep talking about it.
So yeah, so I try to go there daily just to keep an eye on what's happening there. That's a whole, I mean, other conversation about how certain communities are facing this. People in the Hasidic Orthodox community have been kind of late to don face masks, and they live very much in close quarters, and they celebrate funerals, as you can see with this. And so it's been tough. They've been hit pretty hard, but I do notice a lot more masks there these days. So hopefully it's kind of precautions are taking hold. Yeah, so sure. I mean, nothing. This was in Queens, and you know, again, it was just a mother and her daughter walking by this trauma center, which has become very active. And I'm just trying to get a feeling of the restlessness of ordinary people. And also people like this, you know, the kind of stoic, here are two slightly, you know, elderly people, I'd say in their 70s and you know, they look kind of nice and they're strolling they look like they're just on an afternoon stroll down Fifth Avenue, which is kind of a relief to see people that decide to come out, and you know, they have their mask on, they're being responsible. But yeah, this was actually the gentleman, if you go back to that one, the gentleman who I talked about earlier, who was able to track me down and wanted me to autograph something in the newspaper. So he was, you know, for his grandkids to show them what he was doing during these days. So interesting guy. Yeah, some homeless people. You can find the subway system. I don't know about in the UK, but in the US, the subway system is pretty much overwhelmed right now with homeless. It's really very sad there.
Can you tell us about this one?
This, they were setting up beds in one of the biggest cathedrals in Manhattan. They were going to turn it into a field hospital. And it never really materialized as far as I know. This was in the beginning days when they were setting it up, and there was a lot of panic and fear that that New York City would be overwhelmed with patients and wouldn't have enough places. So there's a tent field hospital in Central Park. There's this field hospital. Luckily, the number of patients is starting to come down, and it never really reached that critical crisis point where they had to start putting people in these cathedrals. But yeah, this was you know, the days where it was very uncertain. There was a lot of panic, and yeah.
Spencer, are there any other particular images? Otherwise, I'm going to pull us out of the slideshow and just bring the three panelists back on.
No, I mean, I can kind of go on about any bit of the story, but no, there's nothing in particular I really need to now.
Okay, so I mean, we have like 10 minutes to go, and I have some more questions. I was trying to keep an eye on the chat the whole time, and I feel like we did a pretty good job of some of the questions, even that came in later. We answered them early, so panelists can always go back to the recording. If anyone is listening and has a question, either that you posted and we just missed it by accident, or a new question, throw it into the chat. Spencer, are there any other particular ethical issues that you've been thinking about or encountering specific to coverage of COVID-19?
Yeah, yeah, there are. I mean, getting back to what I was saying earlier, just by being outside and taking trains and going to supermarket, the things that I'm doing every day covering this, you really have to be concerned about potentially infecting other people, because you're never quite sure unless you're getting tested every day for this. And that's something, I think in the beginning days of this, we were all a little cavalier about that, a little like, oh, there was certain, it's always been hard to, do you have a fever, or do you have a cough? And then it turns out that it doesn't matter if you don't, you could have none of the symptoms and still be spreading it. And I don't think we've gotten quite a hold on where the public stands on that, who is infected, who isn't. It's just kind of, we're starting to get up to speed on that. We've been behind a lot of other nations like South Korea and Japan and even Germany. So we've been really slow with that. And that is, something that I'm reminded of often. I do have a responsibility and a need and a desire to witness this, to report this, but you also want to be a responsible member of your community. So, and obviously getting back to what you were saying earlier, it is always difficult to photograph people who are really in desperate situations, and whether they're being taken in an ambulance or they're on the street, and there's no ironclad law, or you just have to go with your gut on those things, and it can be difficult. So yeah, I mean, those are issues that are constantly, and with me, it's also it's not so much an ethical, but the desire, as I was saying earlier, to cover this not only responsibly, but to cover it thoroughly and cover it well. I mean, it is your job as a photographer, a photojournalist, whatever you want to define yourself as. This moment will pass, thank God, but I do want to be a person that can hold my head up and say, you know what, I faced that difficult situation as best I could. I faced it as bravely as I could. And I want to feel proud of myself that I did my job. I worked as hard as I could during this. I've had many experiences in the past where I felt I kind of let myself down. I didn't do something as thoroughly. I think even 9/11, strangely enough for me, I was pretty young and naive, and I was a little in shock at that event. So in the following weeks and days, I feel I didn't do my best work, and things like that have stayed with me, and I try to keep motivated every day to go back out and to try to get strong pictures.
I'm going to ask you one last question that came from the audience, but also asking you for brevity in response, because we're going to wrap soon. There were a few more questions that came in, and since we don't have time for all of them, I'm just going to pull one, which is, I guess, access issues aside, has there been any image that you haven't taken? Like, it's been presented, it's in front of you, but you don't take it, and why?
Yeah, I mean, that certainly has happened in my career. There have been people that have, whether it be in Lesbos, Greece, and desperate refugees that are, you put your camera down off, when you have to, at the end of the day, you're a human being. And for me right now in this stage in the story, no, I haven't, besides hospitals and other things, some ambulance in the street, I haven't really, gone into morgues or anything like that. And I don't, I may, there's something, I may be doing that soon. And I don't, those are always, I'm not that kind of photographer. Again, I hate to repeat myself, but my inspiration comes from these kind of great street photographers that always blended the melancholy and the beautiful together. And I try to keep a distance from things that are too difficult visually. I know it's important. I know people need to take them, but that's really not where I am as a photographer. I do like my images to give, I guess, a sense of beauty and hope, if that's not cliched. But
no, that's
yeah,
actually probably that's like a
place
nice
to
spot for us to wrap, right?
All right.
I'm gonna thank you, Spencer.
Thank you,
Sarah, and the Frontline
Lauren.
Freelance
Yes.
Register. I'm gonna turn it back over to Sarah. The questions for everyone in the audience, I'm sorry we didn't get to every single question. I will say the questions that came in that we didn't get to, a lot of them are addressed by Spencer in my book, not specific to COVID, but they're questions that pertain across crises. So if anybody wants to hear more from Spencer or other photographers' perspectives, I did put the info on the book, Conversations on Conflict Photography. Sarah, should I turn it to you? Sarah looks like she might be frozen. Maybe it's a connection issue.
I think it is.
Yeah,
Okay.
and just to thank Lauren and Spencer, that we learned so much actually because I was taking notes as you were talking. We will be. Oh, sorry. Hi, sorry. I have bad internet in South London. Let's say thank you, and we'll be.
Thank you.
Everything online is all recorded.